and enjoy the program.
All right, thank you, Jenny, very much. And before we get too much further along, I do want to take a moment to remember those who were killed in last night's shooting in Monterey Park, mass shooting. So please join me in remembering those who lost their lives in that event. I also want to take the opportunity to share something with you that we have just started to implement at the homestead, and that is a land acknowledgement that we are now recognizing, as all of us should, about the fact that while the families who occupied the homestead, the Workman and Temple families, for about 90 years, their story is just part of what has existed over time immemorial. So we are acknowledging that the site is situated on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the native peoples. Titles like Gabrieleño being used. We recognize that the indigenous people were the traditional stewards of this land. We acknowledge and pay respect to them, their ancestors, elders, relatives, and relations, past, present, and emerging, and recognize that their cultural and spiritual connection to this place continues. This is a continuing series of presentations about the history of the Workman and Temple families in greater Los Angeles, not just at the homestead and the immediate area. So as part of this, we're now into the 1910s, and transformations continuing as they always do with people in a given place at a certain time. And so there'll be a lot of discussion about different members of the families in Los Angeles, in parts of the San Gabriel Valley, and what they were up to during this period of time. One thing to bring forward, as we always do with these presentations, certainly when we talk about the later 19th century and onwards, is the continuing series of booms, population, economic growth, and what have you, that really started at the end of the 1860s, early 1870s, and other in the late 1880s when William H. Workman, nephew of homestead founders William Workman and Nicolás Urioste, was mayor of the city. Another one in the very first years of the 20th century when William H. Workman happened to be city treasurer. And it just continues. So in the teens, you have another period of exceptional growth. This is a photograph of part of downtown Los Angeles during that era. And so the buildings are getting taller. 6, 7 stories would not be uncommon. We haven't gotten to the height limit yet, which would be 11 stories. And I'll talk about more of that in the 1920s presentation in a few months. But certainly a lot of growth going on. This is a more residential area of downtown during that period as well. But the growth was extending outwards into the suburbs. And during the teens, you had the Los Angeles Aqueduct, for example, being brought in. And that was life-saving for the development of Los Angeles because obviously there was only a certain amount of water that was available. And so when the spigot was turned on in 1913, that allowed for a lot of growth within Los Angeles, but it was happening outside too. So in the San Gabriel Valley, out here in the very eastern part, one of the big trends was that with the death of Lucky Baldwin, who had obtained a huge amount of property from the Workman and Temple families when he foreclosed on a loan made to their bank at the end of the 1870s, he died in 1909. And so shortly afterwards, as the estate was being settled, a lot of property became available for purchase and development. And in our area, meaning the eastern San Gabriel Valley, that included in the early teens, North Whittier Heights, which is now known as Hacienda Heights. Another tract was given different names, tract 1343, which isn't super exciting. So La Fortuna Farms was a name given to it. And we now know that area, or most of it, is Avocado Heights, immediately west of the homestead out to Workman Mill Road. So just some examples of how development was continuing during the 1910s. I mentioned William Henry Workman, nephew of the homestead's founders. He, as I said before, was mayor of Los Angeles in the late 1880s and city treasurer in the first decade for most of that period of time. In the teens, he was settling in as kind of an elder statesman, if you want to put it that way. He was often consulted to give speeches and to talk about how things had changed in the 50 years since he had moved to Los Angeles or longer. Here he is in Hollenbeck Park, which was part of Boyle Heights, still is a city park, that he donated 2/3 of the land for in honor of a friend of his, Johnny Hollenbeck, who had died relatively young. On the right is an article about the fact that a middle school was going to be established in Boyle Heights, and Workman was a donor of the 10-acre tract for that. That became known as Boyle Heights Intermediate School and is now Hollenbeck Junior High School, very close across the street from the Roosevelt High School in Boyle Heights. So he continued his active involvement in Boyle Heights, which he had established with some partners back in the 1870s. And in terms of as a realtor and also with things like establishing schools and what have you. Another example, this is a Workman walking through the yard of his house, which was on a bluff overlooking downtown Los Angeles. There is a Japanese-American retirement home there now, although there is talk that the owners want to shut that down and then develop the property. Always a big issue these days with gentrification and other concerns about development. But as this article from the teens shows, it talks about Boyle Heights and the development of Mr. Workman and his associates in its early days. He was also, as I said, a speaker at events. So when the Los Angeles County Pioneers, and this would be an organization exclusively of white people, primarily those of middle and upper class, he was president of that group, and they would have functions and he would frequently speak and what have you. Now, one of the things that Workman did late in his life was he got to go back home, home meaning his father's birthplace in England, also that of his uncle William Workman from the homestead. And so in 1912, he went to see where his ancestors came from and went to France and all that. And so it got to be in the news because Uncle Billy, as he was popularly known, was quite a well-known figure in those days, to the extent that when the Los Angeles Express decided to find out who its oldest subscriber was, it turned out to be Uncle Billy Workman. There he is shown on the right, holding a bound copy of probably the first book of the Express, which started in 1871. So this is about 1917, thereabouts. The photograph above him is of a building on Main Street in Los Angeles where William H. Workman and his brother Elijah long had the Workman Brothers saddlery. You would know that if you were walking the streets in those days, because you had to just look at the top of the building and see the horse up there with the name Harness on it and the address of 76 Main Street. The Lanfranco building, as it was called, long gone. And the harness and saddlery shop was shut down about 1880. William H. and his wife Mariah Boyle celebrated their 50th anniversary in 1917. Again, it's a fairly decent amount of coverage in the newspapers about that. And then within a short time, William H., about several months later, passed away early in 1918 at the age of 79. This is a photograph of the banquet hall that was arranged for this 50th anniversary. There are probably 500 people in that room, so quite a big to-do. And you can see the stage back there. I'm sure there was a band playing and then speeches and what have you. The death of William H. Workman was commemorated in many publications. On the left is Los Angeles Times saying that he had died in the harness, reference to his days with his saddlery shop. Second to the left is from the Tidings, the Roman Catholic newspaper. Even though William H. was raised Protestant as a young man, when he married Mariah Boyle, who was of Irish extraction, the family became Roman Catholic and remains so today. And just some other articles from different papers, editorials, and talking about his intelligent public spirit, his pioneer efforts, being mayor, and so forth. So kind of an end of an era, actually, in a sense, because in the teens, you started to see a lot of the so-called pioneers who had been around maybe in the 1850s, 60s, were starting to pass away. But there were the other generations of the family, specifically three of the children of William H. and Mariah Boyle. Oldest child was Boyle Workman. I mentioned him before in a couple of these talks. He was assistant to his father when William H. was mayor in the 1880s and again, city treasurer in the first decade of the 20th century. Boyle continued on in business. He had been involved in real estate as a young man, and as often is the case with the elite, they have a lot of connections one to the other. And so he is vice president, for example, of the American Savings Bank and then Home Savings Bank when there was a merger of that. And so he was known for being a banker during the teens, but he also joined the Public Service Commission, which was created at a time when a lot of changes were happening in municipal government, not just in Los Angeles, but in other cities across the United States. The progressive era often meant having the types of commissions that you would see very commonly from then till today as a way to have citizens have a little more oversight over city government. How well that worked, of course, is going to depend on conditions from one place to the other, but he was a public service commissioner for several years during the teens, and that actually opened him up for other political opportunities. On the left there, you can see he's considered one of the representative men of Southern California, not representative women shown in this, obviously, but you can see that the mayor of the time is one of those, Frederick T. Woodman, Stoddard Jess, who was kind of a prominent banker, and what have you. But Boyle Workman is definitely setting himself up to carry on the tradition that his father, and to a certain extent his uncle Elijah, had developed decades before by being involved in politics and municipal commissions and what have you. So to that end, in 1919, Boyle decided, just after his father had died, that he would run for the city council. The Los Angeles Times article on the left plays up this idea of tradition, shows a picture of Boyle, his birthplace and child home, pictures of his father and also his grandfather, Andrew Boyle, for whom he's obviously named. Andrew Boyle was a member of the city council. So Boyle was looking to be the third generation of his family to serve on that body. He was successful in winning election in 1919, actually polled the highest number of votes, as can be seen on the column on the left there, and then was immediately chosen to be president of the council and remained in that role for most of his tenure, which lasted 8 years from 1919 to 1927. And in the talk that comes up in April for the 1920s with the family history, we'll talk more about some of the activities in which he was involved with the city council back then. His sister, however, also had a major role. It's not easy to find women in public presence in these years. And when you do, they're typically going to be of the elite in Los Angeles, the white elite. So you've got women who are involved in the Friday Morning Club and the Needlework Guild, and during World War I, a variety of charitable endeavors, Red Cross and what have you. Mary Julia's entree really into a major public presence comes through the establishment of the Brownson House, which was a Roman Catholic settlement facility. We would not do these things this way today, but the idea was to work with immigrant populations, many of whom were concentrated north of the plaza in what had been called Sonora Town in the 19th century because of the proliferation of native-born Mexicans, mostly from northern Mexico, like the state of Sonora, who were residing there. But by the early 20th century, it was more of a multi-ethnic community. You would have Italians, there were Asians, and others who were living, Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans living in that community. And so Chinatown is there now, most of that area. So the Brownson House was really aimed at trying to Americanize people. And on the article on the left, you can see that this is an article that she wrote in the early teens for the Tidings, the Roman Catholic newspaper. It talks about the melting pot. And for those of us of a certain age, that's what we were taught in school not that long ago, that we were a melting pot. And there's a lot of debate about what that really means. But one of the things here was to try to get people to become American, meaning to pay less attention to the culture from which they came from, either born into or raised in, and to become English speakers, to learn traditions here, to become patriotic, which was an increasingly big thing, especially during World War I and all of that. So these are just a couple of articles. The one on the right shows on the bottom Mary Julia with one of her charges at the Brownson House. She was president for almost 20 years of this institution, and some other examples, including celebrities who were coming out to address the Brownson House. And by celebrities, we're not talking about movie stars and that sort of thing. It's more about prominent men in town, typically a judge, for example, the state chair of the Immigration and Housing Commission, which is another Americanization project within California. The head of the State Normal School for Teacher Education, Mary Julia Workman, was educated there and was a kindergarten teacher for a number of years. And his topic was the Mexican in our country and his peculiar problems there. So the wording is striking for sure. But the idea, again, was to try to find a way to Americanize the folks who were being served by Brownson House. The Wright article is another one from the tidings that Mary did during her tenure. One of our volunteers and docents, Jose Castro, who graduated from Cal State San Bernardino last year, wrote his thesis on Mary Julia and her work at the Brownson House. We did a multi-part summary of contents of his thesis on our blog just recently. So you are encouraged definitely to go look into more of what Mary Julia did through Jose's work. Father Michael Eng, who is now at Loyola Marymount University, was the president of Santa Clara University for a number of years, has also written extensively about Mary Julia Workman's work. So there are other sources for sure if you want to learn more about that. She did, however, wind up resigning just as the teens came to an end. Early 1920, she stepped down. And there was some conflict about how charities were being operated within the church locally. A priest was appointed to basically oversee all of that. And his way of doing things did not square with how she'd been used to doing her work for 20 years. And so she stepped down. It didn't really get reported in the press. And so she moved into other things. So, for example, she was very involved in a Catholic Women's Club. And so these two articles from 1920 refer to that. We didn't see anything in the paper about her resignation from Brownson House, but we did see her moving into other activities. And again, in the 1920s, we'll talk more about her because she continued to expand her role, not just within the Catholic charitable world, but also in municipal commissions. So we'll continue her story with that. There was another child of William H. Workman and Maria Boyle, sister to Boyle Workman and Mary Julia. Her name was Gertrude, and she had an interesting career during the teens and into the 1920s as an actor. And often wonder how the reaction of her parents might have been to that she wanted to go into that field. But she began acting actually in the first years of the 20th century, the late 1900s. And continued that. She went off to Stanford to do graduate work. And how many women, by the way, were doing that, graduate work that early on? But she was quite well known as a thespian up there in Palo Alto, came back to Los Angeles and continued her work. And even when she married in 1915, married a man named Furman from the East Coast, she wound up in New York and continued to act on the legitimate stage, which was kind of an accomplishment because there were very few Los Angeles actors, men or women, who were doing that kind of thing. So this is an article on the left from the Times under the heading of breezy gossip. I'm not sure whether it's gossip. It's just a report, basically, that she had headed off to New York to begin a professional acting career. On the right is just a little tidbit from a newspaper mentioning that she was at the Princess Theater in New York. So this was a legitimate stage, as they called it, and acting in plays out there. And so again, we'll kind of touch on her later career in the 1920s when she came back to Los Angeles, but just an interesting little story, part of the Workman family experience during the teens. But as far as actors go, it was hard to top the story of Josephine M. Workman. She is a cousin of Gertrude and the others that I've mentioned. Her father, Joseph, was the only son of William Workman and Nicolaso Urioste of Rancho La Puente, where the homestead is. She was the only of her family born in Los Angeles. Her other siblings were actually born in what is now the Bassett community, not too far from La Puente, not too far from the homestead. And I'll talk more about that relative to Josephine in the 1920s. But she was a whistler as a young woman, meaning she would professionally whistle in theaters. That was a thing back at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And then she married a musician, had a daughter, and unfortunately, terrible tragedies. Within a few years, she lost both, her husband and daughter, her only child. And so she wound up answering an ad, apparently, in a local newspaper looking for an exotic type to play Indian roles. And we are dealing with a lot of this now about cultural appropriation and who is acting in what role in movies. Well, in the early days, obviously, that was not a concern for producers and others who were making these pictures. But Josephine may have had some Native ancestry, and I want to emphasize the word may. Her father's mother, Nicolaso Urioste, was from Taos, New Mexico, where there was and still is a very prominent pueblo of the indigenous people there. In fact, Josephine's father and her aunt Antonia Margarita Workman, were baptized in the church in the Indian Pueblo in Taos, not the European church in the southern part of town. That's suggestive. It's not certainly definitive. Her mother's mother was from Chile on the west coast of South America, so it may be possible there was some Indian or native ancestry from there as well. In any case, there is Josephine out of costume on the left, holding up what I presume is her pet dog. But on the right is an early reference to her from the end of 1910. And on the bottom, it says, "A child of the wild." This is actually a movie theater in Indiana. So she was already acting in pictures that were being distributed throughout the country. And at the bottom, it says that the part of the Indian girl in this picture is played by Miss Mona Darkfeather, a full-blooded Indian girl with strong dramatic talent. Well, obviously, the publicity and promotion machine of Hollywood is already in full bore, and they were alternately presenting her as a full-blooded Indian, but sometimes they would be pretty honest, or she would be and say that she wasn't, but she was from an aristocratic Spanish family. And again, Spanish is a term that sounds better than Mexican, or in her case, actually mixed ancestry. She was multi-ethnic. On the left is an autographed photo from the museum's collection, and that was her standard garb. That was the appropriated role that she took as a supposed Native person. On the right is one of many newspaper articles that featured her and her roles, but it says on the bottom, "Speaks several Indian languages fluently." And she did say that occasionally in interviews. Was that really true? We don't really know for sure, but I suspect probably not. But they said that she is the greatest exponent of the Indian woman working before the motion picture camera with the Bison Company out here in Los Angeles. We had a donation a couple of years ago of photographs and other items that had belonged to Josephine, i.e. Princess Mona Darkfeather. The donation was from the family of her longtime landlords. She lived in the Silver Lake area until her death in 1977. She had been out of contact with any of her family. She was a ward at the state of California, so whatever was left behind would have probably been thrown out. But the family actually saved this stuff and fortunately donated them to us a couple of years ago. So the photo on the left is one of the many that came out of that collection, for which we're very thankful. On the right, just another newspaper clipping showing her and a fellow actor, Artie Ortega. Eagle Wing, another name there. Sometimes there were actual indigenous people used in some of these films, as we've had some presentations here from Angela Leese, for example, about some of that early history and Native characters and Native actors. Another photo on the left there from that recent donation, and an interview from one of the publications in the motion picture industry from about 1914. This one calls her distinctly different. She is known all over the civilized world. Now, that might be a slight exaggeration, but it is said again that she is recognized as one of the best moving picture Indians appearing on the screen. Well, using the term moving picture Indians might be a way of suggesting that she really wasn't a Native person, but is acting as one. And they felt they had to say that she had never set foot on the legitimate stage, only in front of the motion picture camera. She's a curiosity, and she's never had to travel to acquire her reputation, and et cetera. By the way, at the bottom of that, it does mention that she is under the direction of Frank Montgomery, a former stage and film actor who was her director for a number of years, and they actually together had a production company. So in early to mid-teens, I would say 1912 to 1915, she was quite successful and quite well known, if not the entire civilized world, certainly through many parts of the United States. She did try to break character and get out of some of the typecasting. However, the way that was done was in a very racist way. In other words, some of you might know about Henry Morton Stanley. I was just reading about him in a book about the Congo River recently. Stanley was a famed explorer, a native of England, who actually spent most of his early life in America. Stanley tromped around Africa for many, many years. And there was a motion picture series that was kind of based on that. And so there she is sitting on the chair next to a figure playing a white man. You can see that the actor sitting on the ground next to her is clearly in blackface, while the characters behind her, the extras, I suppose, who are playing obviously African tribesmen, they're not going to get credit or be known for their roles in this. But these were a series of pictures in the mid-teens in which Mona Darkfeather starred, not playing an Indian, but still in a type of film that obviously fell out of favor, and as it should have long ago. The White King of the Zaras is one of those films, as you can see from this advertisement from a newspaper in the East Coast. By the later part of the 1910s, her star started to fade. That might have been largely because the Indian picture genre was starting to go out of fashion. She was also in her later 30s, so playing a young Indian maiden might have been more of a challenge as time went on. I imagine it's probably a combination of both, maybe more about the Indian picture demise. But she continued to try to keep that persona going. So in 1918, 1919, she wound up traveling and doing a live show. And so the photo on the left is one of those, I think, taken in Washington State. You can see she's posed with a couple of fans, and there's boards with images from her films. And the large sign refers to her as Mona Darkfeather, Indian Princess. She and her husband, Frank Montgomery, actually moved to the Pacific Northwest to try to develop another phase of their career. It did not work out particularly well. They wound up in Los Angeles by the early 20s, and we'll pick up the story with that, including a very interesting lawsuit that she filed regarding some land that she was to inherit from her father. By the way, on the right, interesting little tidbit, another exaggeration. Princess Darkfeather has a record for her work. She claimed that in 8 years, she was in more than 500 pictures. It is worth pointing out that almost all the films made in Hollywood up to a certain point were one-reeler, very short movies, 12 to 15 minutes. Whether she actually appeared in 500 films, maybe as an extra in a lot of these, who knows for sure. But you can at least see some of the companies she worked for if you're into early silent film. Bison, I mentioned, Selig Zoo at Lincoln Park, may be familiar to some of you. Universal, which was a small company when it got started, as they all were, it became a dominant motion picture company. Caleb and Mutual being other ones. And we're now going to switch gears and move over to the Temple family, and specifically the family descendants of William Workman and Nicolaso Urioste through their daughter, Antonia Margarita Workman, who married F.P.F. Temple back in the 1840s. They had a large family of 11 children, 8 of which survived to adulthood. One of them was William W. Temple, who I mentioned in a couple of the previous presentations. He was trained to be a lawyer and went to Harvard Law School in the 1870s, and then went to London to study at the Inns of Court. And the goal or the idea was to have him basically be a legal representative for his father, who was a prominent banker and businessman in the 1870s era. But the failure of the Temple and Workman Bank in Los Angeles in 1876 really obviously transformed the family. William, who was a newly minted attorney, came back from London and was overwhelmed with all kinds of work trying to help his family members sort through this financial disaster. And it wound up driving him to leave the area, join the army. He wound up serving for several years in the 1880s. And then after he mustered out, he basically stayed out of the area, wound up in New Mexico, and then in Mexico for many years. Did not come back to Los Angeles until the revolution in Mexico in 1910. And as I mentioned in the last talk, wrote a couple of published tracts about his experiences in Mexico, and another one about his opposition to women's suffrage. So he was definitely not in the vanguard of progressive thought in those days. William wound up as an inmate in the county hospital and was supported by his brother Walter. And one of the interesting dynamics of that, which I'll talk about in more detail later, is that as Walter was starting to maybe benefit from some potential oil investments or opportunities, William was advising him on how to handle that from a legal standpoint. And just before Walter reaped his big fortune, William Temple died. This was in February 1917, so the obituary on the left there. William was one of the older of the family. The youngest was Charles, and I talked quite a bit about Charles in the earlier talks of the 1900s and 1910s, mainly because of his legal problems and family feuds with his first wife's brothers. His first wife died within months of getting married, and the brothers accused Charles of having involvement in that, actually being directly involved in her death. There's no evidence of that necessarily, but there were a couple of incidents between Charles and his brothers-in-law. And in one case, he killed a brother-in-law in the saloon that he operated in one of the Temple family homes of ancient date, meaning decades. And so Charles wound up leaving this area because of that. His legal problems. He wound up being acquitted of the crime of murder of his brother-in-law, but he probably thought it would be a good idea to skip town. He wound up in Arizona, living with one of his sisters for many years. Died in 1918 in October, just as his brother was coming into a significant fortune. And I believe the photo on the right may be the funeral of Charles in the family cemetery, El Campo Santo, at our museum site. You can see the iron fence behind the two gentlemen. In fact, one of them was leaning on it. And then behind, just weeds 4 or 5 feet high. The cemetery was in ruins. In the center, just below the flowers, you can see a couple of wooden headstones. So who knows, actually there's 3 of them now that I can see, that had survived devastation of the cemetery. It was an owner of the homestead who was not a member of the family in the early part of the 20th century, the first years of the 1900s, who started to take out the cemetery, just basically dismantle it, desecrate it. And Walter Temple wound up suing and halting that. And we'll kind of pick up the story a little bit towards the end and then continue that into the 1920s. One of the other family members to talk about at some length here is John H. Temple, another brother of Walter's. John H. actually owned the homestead for about a decade in the late 1880s through the late 1890s. John was unfortunately owner of the property during a pretty difficult time. There was a financial depression in 1893 that lasted for quite a while. There were 6 years of drought in our area during that period. And being a farmer and trying to grapple with both of those conditions would, of course, be devastating. And so John wound up getting into financial trouble because he borrowed money from a bank to try to keep his operations at the homestead going. And that led to foreclosure in 1899, after which he moved to Boyle Heights for a while. And then in the 1910 census shown here was living in South Los Angeles, not too far from Jefferson High School, if anybody knows what it is, south of the 10 freeway and east of the 110. And at the time he was working as a shipping clerk for a chemical company and basically just trying to keep himself going. I want to point out that one of his sons, about the 5th person down on the list here, I should probably have turned on the pointer, which I can still do. Right down here, we have several children in the family, 6 sons and 1 daughter. But Adrian, one of the sons, was a sailor in the Navy at that time. And I'm pointing that out because when we get to World War I, John had a very unusual distinction in terms of his sons and their service. There were 2 sisters in the Temple family, Lucinda Zuniga, who we talked about in earlier presentations. She married a man who grew up in the same community as the Temples were living in, which was called Misión Vieja, or Old Mission, where the first mission San Gabriel was established in the 1770s. It didn't last long there because of all the flooding from the San Gabriel River as it entered in the Whittier Narrows. And so the mission moved to its current location. But there was a community there for many decades, primarily of Latinos and Spanish speakers. But Lucinda's second husband, Manuel Zuniga, they operated a store, saloon, and billiard parlor in an adobe house called the Basie Adobe from the 1860s. And I'm pointing that out because that will bear into our story a little bit later during this presentation. But Lucinda and her husband decided to move to Clifton, Arizona, a copper mining boom town during that era, because Manuel wanted to pursue opportunities out there. And then they were joined by her younger brother, Charles, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. The other daughter was Margarita Temple. She married Samuel P. Rowland, who was a grandson of John Rowland and Encarnacion Martinez, original grantees of Rancho La Puente. And so Sam Rowland was originally a druggist and then got into real estate in the early 20th century. And he was the sales agent for a property I mentioned a little bit earlier. So I'm going to have the pointer here on the right side of the screen. Where I'm dragging the pointer is where the homestead is. But to the west of that, all the way out to Workman Mill Road, close to the San Gabriel River, was this tract 1343 that I mentioned before, that had become available after Lucky Baldwin's death in 1909. Purcell, Gray, and Gale was the firm that acquired it. We have a Gale Avenue in our area, City of Industry mostly, Hacienda Heights. that was named for J. Fred Gale, one of the partners in this. But Sam Rowland was the sales agent for a while, but he had his office in Los Angeles. He died in the middle teens, and so Margarita wound up as a widow with several children. When Walter Temple came into his very significant family fortune, he had both of his sisters wind up living with him at the homestead, which we'll talk about more in the 1920s, part of this presentation. And that takes us to Walter, who is living in the Old Mission community in the Whittier Narrows, not too far south of Whittier Narrows Regional Park. He and his brother Charles had inherited 50 acres from their mother that had been sold to her from Baldwin, so they got to keep some of their property. When Charles had his legal problems and decided to move to Arizona, he sold his interest in the 50 acres to his brother Walter. So Walter's in the back by one of the lower branches of the tree here with his snap brim cap. His wife, Laura Gonzalez, who grew up in that neighborhood with him, who was also basically the right-hand person for Walter's brother Francis at the homestead back in the 1880s. I talked about that during the presentation. We have an upcoming event called Love Letters for Valentine's Day in February. We'll bring some of that to bear too because of letters written by Walter to Laura that we can share with people. They didn't get married until they were well into their 30s in the early part of the 20th century. And then they had 5 children. One daughter died as an infant, and there were 4 survivors. 3 of them are here. So the youngest, Edgar, is in his mom's arms. Agnes, the only daughter in the front here with the checkered dress. And then in the overalls is the oldest, Thomas Workman Temple II. There is another boy, and his name was Walter P. Temple Jr. I remember him telling me that he was hiding behind his father in this photograph, which is why he didn't appear. He was there, but he just didn't show up. And Walter was always a shy person as it was. But they're standing at their 50-acre ranch. You see the barn in the background that Walter had basically inherited from his mom and then took his brother's interest. He was a walnut farmer, apple farmer, a teamster. He sold insurance. He was trying all kinds of things to support his family. And sometimes he had some financial problems, had to borrow money. And a lot of his years were struggling to keep the family in a good financial position. But as we'll talk about as we move through here, it's going to change dramatically for them. This is a map from 1903, and that was the year that he and Laura got married. So up here towards the top right, we have a couple of tracks here that I'm going to bring the pointer around where it has Walter's name, and it's just about 50 acres. So that was the old homestead. If you know this area at all, this is Rothmead Boulevard coming up from the community of Pico, and then south of that was Rivera, and we now have Pico Rivera as a town to the south. The Whittier Narrows Dam would be right where I'm bringing the pointer in here. Up to the top, we have San Gabriel Boulevard, obviously coming down from Mission into this area. And then Durfee Avenue would come off to the northeast where I have the pointer. And so that hopefully gives you an idea. The Whittier Narrows Regional Park is on this upper right corner where it says Rancho Potrero Chico. Now, the Temple family had been the half owners of this Rancho La Merced, which was about 2,400 acres. William Workman had actually obtained that in 1850 by foreclosing on a loan he made to its grantee, Casilda Soto de Lobo. And so he gave his daughter and her husband half that ranch, and he gave his ranch foreman from Rancho La Puente, Juan Matias Sanchez, the other half. But when the bank that the Workmans and Temples owned in the 1870s failed, and Lucky Baldwin loaned money and then foreclosed on that loan, that's why Baldwin's name is right here, very prominent, where it says Old Mission. Baldwin took over most of that property. But when Baldwin died in 1909, his executor was selling property left and right. And so Walter approached the executor of Mr. Baldwin and posited the idea of acquiring some land right over here where it says Rio Hondo and this section and into the hills where my cursor is right now, 60 acres. Now, Walter didn't have the cash to pay for it outright, so he arranged some financing with the executor to do this. And by the way, this 60 acres was land his father had owned before the bank failure and the loan to Baldwin. So there's no small amount of irony with all of this. And one reason why Walter was probably trying to do this is because two main things. One is that there was frequent flooding from the Rio Hondo, which is visible here, where my cursor is, and off to the right, just outside of the image, the San Gabriel River. And so they're kind of in an interesting position in the Whittier Narrows, this property, where you just get this funnel effect of water. It's kind of amazing the temples were able to survive as long as they did out there. But there was major flooding in 1909 and 1910, for example, that did quite a bit of damage to his property. And it happened again later. Another thing that happened was he sold some land over here to the right where it says W.W. Powell in this general area to the city of Pasadena. And when floodwaters came in, the land got inundated, and the city of Pasadena really didn't do anything to drain the water, but you got mosquitoes and other nuisances. And so Walter was probably not happy with that situation. But maybe more important than this was that oil development was really ramping up in the early 20th century. The city of Los Angeles oil field was in the early 1890s. And then in Whittier, not too far outside of the boundary of this particular map, oil was being developed in the early years of the 20th century. So it seemed to make sense that between Los Angeles and Whittier, there might be oil in places like the Montebello Hills. So this area that I'm circling here on the center and top left is a large area of hills that is now being developed, much of it into residential. And there's still a couple of oil wells, I think, that may still be pumping on a part of it. But Temple and a friend of his from El Monte, a merchant and real estate speculator named Milton Kaufman, they were aware of what was going on. And Kaufman seems to have advised Temple that maybe it'd be a good idea to see if they could try to get some of the property over closer to the hills and be part of the hills. And maybe there might be oil there. Did Baldwin's executor have any idea of this? Who knows? The fact that he made the deal is a little bit interesting. But not to worry for the Baldwin heirs. There were two daughters, Clara Stalker and Anita Baldwin, because they retained the other 800 acres and they made a fortune when oil was eventually found there. Just wanted to show you the photo of the Temple family homes on that homestead that I pointed out, that 50 acres. Those were actually burned in a fire somewhere in the first years of the 20th century. This is an article about the lawsuit. Very close to that, this property where these homes were was where the city of Pasadena had this property that was flooding, and Walter claimed it was a nuisance. Purportedly, a lot of the other people in the area, ranchers, were supporting him in this case. Walter was asking for $10,000 in damage to property because he had an orchard that he said was flooded by this water from the Pasadena property, and also for the health of his family. He did not win that lawsuit, but he right afterwards moved. Sold his property and moved a little bit to the west. Also wanted to point out this article, which talks about the flooding of that era. There were major floods, actually 3 of them, within about 7 years, from 1909 to 1916. And that was one of many reasons why the county of Los Angeles began to really take flood control more seriously, not just because of here, but also the LA River and other places. And it took a while, but the Whittier Narrows Dam finally got built in the 1950s in that area. On the bottom, just the 1910 census showing the Temples living in this old mission community where Walter was a farmer, had his own ranch. Walnuts, apples, as I mentioned before. When he moved a little bit to the west, he took over the Basie Adobe, which I mentioned briefly in connection to his sister. That was still there. It was no longer a store and a tavern and a billiard parlor as it had once been, but he moved his family into that house. And that was on the flatlands of the 60 acres, right next to the Rio Hondo. But in the hills, just to the west, he actually had some ideas of what he was going to do with that. He called it Temple Heights, kind of a grandiose name, put a well up there, and actually proposed building a 7-room Spanish mission style house up there. And this article in the Los Angeles Express talks about that he had all kinds of ideas for landscape gardening, making it a picturesque home, that there was going to be oranges and lemons and fruits. And when I saw this some time ago, I thought immediately that this might have been an unrealized idea because it never got done, but he got to carry some of that through with his wife years later at the homestead when they built La Casa Nueva, where our museum is today. But the flooding continued in 1914, even though he had moved his Walnut Ranch to a new location. It was still next to the Rio Hondo. This article talks about 45 acres being lost. He got his name wrong, but it's definitely his property, and said his loss was $50,000, which is an enormous amount of money. And so fortunately for him, he wound up having a big change of fortune. So whatever losses he experienced with this were ameliorated and changed later on. A photo from our collection of the Temple family at Temple Heights, their property on the hills of Montebello. Walter's in the back here, kind of hidden away. His wife, Laura Gonzalez, and three of their children here standing at the left edge. And again, maybe Walter Jr. is hiding somewhere because I don't see him anywhere. But just before a big change is going to happen in their lives. And that comes about because of their oldest son, Thomas W. Temple II. At least this is the main story that gets told. I'll fill that in a little bit later as well. But here's Thomas. He is attending a school called La Puente. It wasn't in La Puente. It was actually in the Whittier Narrows in the old mission community, a school that was, the land was donated by his grandfather. Thomas in this photo, I'm guessing, is probably about 10 or 11. But not long before this, he had been playing in the hills by the family home up in Temple Heights, as they called it, with some friends. And there had been a rain in April, late spring rain. And the story was that as the rainwater went down, seeping up to the surface was oil. And he also smelled a rotten egg smell, which would be your natural gas. That was the story that was frequently told in the press, in the media in those years. It's a great little story for a 9-year-old to find oil. Those of you who might remember the Beverly Hillbillies TV show of days gone by, it's we can call this the Montebello Hillbillies, perhaps. In any case, this article from 1918 by an attorney, John Stone Jones, who was later hired to write the Temple family history, which he never completed. He does talk about that story. It is identified as spring of 1912, which is not possible because they didn't buy the property until later that year. But it talks about a gentle shower and how Thomas went to pick golden poppies. This story tended to get expanded over time and became more and more impressive. And then as he saw a pool of rainwater, he noticed bubbling and smelled gas and ran home to his father. And then it says here that Walter Temple brought some matches, which isn't necessarily a good idea because the gas jet could be of a different size or facing a certain way. But apparently they were able to strike a match and light up the gas that was there. So a very interesting story about the development of the oil. What had also happened, though, is that the Baldwin heirs, the two daughters, had arranged with Standard Oil Company of California, now Chevron, to drill a test well on their part of the Montebello Hills. And early in 1917, this is mid-January, they apparently were starting to get indications of oil at about 2,300 feet. A couple of months later, they actually brought that oil well in. And by then, they'd already started to drill a well on the Temple lease, just within a few hundred feet or yards from the Baldwin test well up in the hills. So this middle article actually talks about that new oil wells were started, including on a property leased to them from Walter P. Temple and Milton Kaufman, who had become his business manager by then. At the April period of 1917, they were really starting to get indications of oil. This article is from the end of June of that year, where it says that Temple oil well number 1 has come in at 600 barrels. And now, with 1/8 of a royalty, the Temple family is starting to get an income that they had never had any inkling they were going to get before. Great photo here on the left. This is probably not the first oil well, but certainly one of those on the hill on the Temple lease. And you can see the oil worker obviously got drenched when the gusher came in. But right away, Temple decided to celebrate. And so they had a barbecue. And it says in this article there were 1,000 people who attended this. To commemorate the first well being brought in the summer of 1917. We actually have an original photograph of that barbecue, and I'm only going to show you just one fragment of it because it's a long panorama, about 3 feet long. But there are the Temples in the middle, Walter and Laura, Thomas, their oldest, Agnes, the daughter, and the 2 younger boys here in the center, with 1,000 of their closest friends, acquaintances, and I'm wondering if these are Standard Oil gentlemen here with their suits and ties in the background. But behind the willow trees was the adobe home that the Temple family was occupying. And so right away, they're enjoying the fruits of their sudden change of fortune. One of the more amazing stories you can think of. A panoramic photograph looking to the west. And so it shows the home that the Temples had been occupying. They abandoned it because of the noise and the smell and all that, and they had the money, so they wound up moving into Monterey Park. initially, and then Alhambra. But you can see the Montebello Hills in the background. And again, we're going to see a lot of change out there in upcoming years as residential and other uses start to take place. On the right is San Gabriel Boulevard, and heading northwest up to the Mission area. Right on this intersection right here, we have the cursor. That's Lincoln Avenue going into Montebello. On the corner was a filling station, gas station that Walter Temple built. And we'll show some other images of that momentarily. In fact, right now, how about do that? So what the view we saw here was looking from the east to the west. This is the other direction. That is San Gabriel Boulevard and a bridge crossing the Rio Hondo. In the background of the Puente Hill. So Rio Hondo College is about where I've got the cursor, if you know where that is. And this is the filling station that Temple constructed. He had his brother John, who was living out in Los Angeles, had him come out and run the gas station full time for him for a while out at this property. So behind the photographer is the Montebello Hills. Another newspaper image showing that area with an inset of Sergeant Thomas W. Temple. He was a sergeant at a military school. He was only 14 years old, I think, or 13 years old when this photo was taken, but it makes it sound like he was in the military. But it talks about him being the discoverer of this. There was another newspaper article that said that the oil indications may have actually been first found when they were driving piles to build a bridge. And I've often wondered if it was this auto bridge for San Gabriel Boulevard. And as they were driving the piles in, there was oil seepage. So that's not as romantic and fun a story as young Thomas's discovery. So I guess you can choose which story sounds better or more plausible to you. Another thing that happened, and Walter Temple was known for doing this. Once his oil money came in, he decided to get involved in philanthropy. So this is the corner of San Gabriel Boulevard and Lincoln Avenue. The oil station I mentioned before is in the background with the red tile roof. You can again see some of the oil wells. This is in 1919, so they were really moving with developing this property as much as they could. But Milton Kaufman, Walter Temple's business manager, had a brother, Joseph, who was killed in the Battle of the Argonne Forest, one of the major battles at the very end of World War I. And so Walter paid for the first private memorial to a deceased soldier from the American Expeditionary Force in France, and had this very impressive cenotaph put up on that corner. It's no longer there because when Walter Temple had financial problems about a decade later, he had it moved to his new community of Temple City. So we'll talk about that more in a subsequent presentation. But a great photo of the dedication ceremony for this. But with the money they had from oil, Temples were able to purchase two major properties at the end of 1917. The first on the upper left was a very substantial home in East Alhambra, and a large property that they decided would become their permanent residence. On the left, by the way, is just a reference to a temporary house that they had. It was actually in Monterey Park, and then they wound up moving to Alhambra. On the bottom is a photo of Laura Gonzalez Temple with her two younger sons, Edgar and Walter, in the garden of this house in Alhambra. And that was the family's full-time residence, and we'll talk more about that in the 1920s presentation. But the other purchase would be of the homestead, where our museum is, a property that had been lost by Walter's brother John in 1899, and for almost 20 years was in the hands of others. But now that Walter's got the money, he purchases it for $40,000, pretty substantial sum for 75 acres, but it was a way to bring the family back to one of their ancestral properties. And there was articles that talked quite a bit about this. The one on the far right is interesting because it goes into the details of the purchase, the fact that he was going to renovate and repair the Workman house on the ranch. But one of the first things he wanted to do was to get the little cemetery in shape. I showed you a photo at the beginning of one of the funerals there. Talks about here that this is a priority of his. But at the end, it says that someone with an ability to write fiction can take this story and make it interesting, because the best part of it is that it is true. And perhaps this is only one of a series of romances to come. And the romance part of it will be carried into the construction of La Casa Nueva by the Temple family, which we'll go into some detail with for the 1920s presentation. All right, so a little bit about the Workman homestead before the Temples purchased it. It was owned by a gentleman and his son-in-law, Pratt and Bassett were their names. Thurston Pratt was the younger man. He had a family that were younger, so they occupied the homestead. This is the 1910 census listing for them while they were living in the Workman house. And Thurston Pratt was farming on the property. A few years ago, we were very fortunate to be able to acquire a series of photographs taken in 1911 when the Pratts were there. So there is the Workman house. And I'm assuming members of the Pratt family. This is the north side of it. The rose bush here in front of the house is still with us today, which is really neat. So I'll just share a couple of the photos from that collection. These were wineries built by William Workman in the 1860s, still standing, and were converted to use for the farming during that period. Obviously, hay baling, so I'm assuming they stored hay in that structure. Great photograph of those wineries, which lasted, by the way, until the early 1970s. And we now have the Homestead Museum Gallery, where this larger building is today. Great photo of Thurston Pratt on his mower as he's out cutting crops on the homestead. I'm assuming this is a little bit to the southwest of the Workman house, looking towards the Puente Hills, where the Puente Hills landfill long existed. So Hacienda Heights being out there, where the dark trees are, probably San Jose Creek, which is the southern boundary of the 75-acre property. So another great photo. As is this one, which is very interesting because to me, this looks like housing for itinerant Latino workers who would be employed during, obviously, picking season to work on these farms and ranches. It is really rare to find these kinds of photographs, if I'm right about this. This appears to be somebody connected to the Pratt family wanting to give something to this little child who looks like that he or she wants nothing to do with this person. If this is the mother, she looks a little bit uncomfortable. It's an interesting photo in that way. It looks like there's a basic shed for tools, but on the left looks like a lean-to, very simple living quarters with a thatched roof. That's why I'm wondering if this is, the housing for farm workers. And again, it's really hard to find these kinds of things. So if this is the case, it's kind of an exceptional image from our collection. Pratt decided maybe the farming was kind of hard to do. There's a lot of work for, if the return isn't all that good, but to lease out the property. And so the Puente Rancho Packing Company was created. And you can obviously see one of the main products they were going to generate from this, which was pork. And or other things too. They were going to can and process tomatoes and other things on the property. But the Puente Rancho Packing Company was on the homestead. The winery building that I showed here was where most of that activity was going to take place. It was actually the large facility and a smaller one back there to the south, and a third one outside of the image of that photo. But that was what was decided to be done by the mid-teens. A great photo showing some of the property. Not sure exactly what this is. It might be a little bit to the south and east of the Workman house. In fact, if you go back to look at the Workman house photo here, that building with the white door might be the same one here, right? So somewhere to the south there. But again, grand plans for how to turn this into a new kind of activity. Article from the LA Times, Temple Winery turned into piggery, meaning they were going to do meat packing where the winery had once been. And it talks about it's in the Temple Ranch and what some of the plans were that the company was going to do, including sauerkraut, because of a cabbage plant set out there, tomato packing and all that sort of thing. That was the big plan out there. And it may have happened. It may have been done for a couple of years, but by late 1917, Walter Temple came up with an offer that was too hard for Pratt and Bassett to refuse. And so for $40,000, he was able to secure the 75-acre homestead. And then he brought his brother John over to be basically the caretaker of the ranch. So as I mentioned, John had been the proprietor, manager of the Temple Oil Station. This is a great little document that I believe the family members still have. But he's writing in a little diary entry in August 1918 about the fact that his son Edmund had come over to visit him because he had been called to the colors. And one of the things that John was very proud of is that he had 4 sons who were in the military at the same time during World War I. This is John with 3 of his sons. I think these 2 were in the military at that time. And he's got a little grandson on his lap here with the Workman house in the background. So kind of a neat little photograph reflecting the fact that here he is 20 years after he lost a place and he's back living there again. kind of in service to his younger brother, Walter, who had just acquired the place himself. Now, as I talked about before, as we wrap up here, Walter had a priority, which was really to get that cemetery fixed up. And so these were early photographs, 1906, from the lawsuit that he had filed against the then owner of the property to stop the desecration of the cemetery. So this is more or less probably what it looked like even in 1917, except maybe just a lot more weeds. And so he had quite a bit of work to do, but this is what he wanted to do, was get the cemetery fixed up first. The photo on the bottom right here shows the water tower, which we still have today, the Workman House. And then what we don't have is a haystacker and windmill out there in the field. But one of the reasons why he had to wait a little while is because there was actually a lease to a Japanese farmer named Yatsuda that was in effect until the end of 1918. So even though he had purchased the property, he had to wait more than a year before he could actually make any major changes to it. But he got his brother installed out there to live in the Workman House. And then as the teens came to an end, Walter Temple began to develop a lot of ambitious plans for not just the homestead, but for other things. And we're going to talk about that in the next presentation. So as we look ahead, we'll talk more about the Los Angeles workmen's, Boyle and Mary Julia, and their continuing activities in municipal and other activities in Los Angeles. Walter Temple and his growing fortune in oil, which not only allowed him to develop the homestead and build La Casa Nueva as a monument to his wife, Laura Gonzalez, who died early in its construction, but also to get involved in real estate in many areas, but including the creation of the town of Temple, as it was first called, now Temple City. And that community was started in spring 1923. So this will be the centennial commemoration of that. And next month, in fact, we'll have a presentation to do just that. So that next 1920s talk is scheduled for April. And so we hope you'll join us then for that presentation. In the meantime, we have some upcoming events. Nonfiction Book Club is meeting on Friday, February 3rd, and they'll be talking about the history of early baseball. So if you're a fan of America's pastime, that would be a great opportunity to maybe get the book read quickly and then join us for that discussion on Friday, the 3rd of February at 10 o'clock. As I mentioned before, around Valentine's Day, the weekend of February 11th and 12th, on our regular tour hours of noon, 1, 2, and 3, we'll have special tours focusing on love letters, dealing with the family letters in particular, and sharing those in spaces in the house in which they often would deal with. And then I mentioned the history of Temple City presentation. That'll be on Sunday, February 19th at 2 o'clock. I will say that we are going to be doing that in person. We are looking at things carefully, obviously, with the flu and RSV and COVID, and things are looking pretty positive right now for us to move into an in-person for that. So you can sign up at homesteadmuseum.org/upcoming events. And in the meantime, you can follow us at Homestead Museum on Facebook and Instagram to know more about those events and our other programs and activities. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Jenny, and thank you all for joining us today. If there are any questions, of course, I'll be happy to try to answer those for you. Thank you again.
All right, as Paul had said, now is a great time if you have any questions to go ahead and type those in, or any comments that you would like to make. I'll give you just a few seconds to do that. I'm going to take a quick look over at Facebook as well. One of our viewers on Facebook had gone to Hollenbeck Junior High School, so some familiar place names you touched on there, Paul.
Great, great. And thank you, Laverne, for your kind comments.
Yeah. Another comment that's just come through. Thank you for sharing this wonderful and historic information. This program has been recorded. So for those that had attended today on Zoom, you will be receiving a link to the recording of this, as well as lots of our other programs given in this series, as well as other topics that we have covered here. And that is all on our YouTube page, but you will be receiving an email tomorrow afternoon with a link to that, as well as a link to a survey It's always very, very helpful for us to know what you guys are thinking about these programs, ways that we can improve. So that will be there as well. So if you could please take just a couple of minutes to fill that out. It really shouldn't take more than 5 or 6 minutes to complete. Paul, another question that's just come in is they're curious to know how many family members are actively involved with the museum.
Today, of course. So just yesterday, we had one of our docents, Cheryl Temple, whose husband is Gary. Gary's a descendant of the John H. Temple family, who I refer to quite a bit today. So we do have that. There are Temple family members who live in Orange County. We've been very well connected with the Workman family in Los Angeles, and just got a donation of some artifacts from that side of the family not that long ago. So yes, we definitely do have close connections with many of the descendants today.
Mary also says, Paul, thank you so much for another great presentation.
And that might be one of them. That might be Mary Temple.
Mary Bartley, yeah.
Yep. Well, thank you, Mary, for joining us.
All right, I'm going to give you guys another just a couple of seconds. If anyone has anything else that they would like to share, any questions that might pop up, any comments that you have. Quick look. No. Annette says, thank you. Another fascinating program, Paul.
Welcome. Thanks for joining.
So with that, I'm going to say thank you guys very, very much for joining us. Also, again, if you would like to subscribe to any of our other upcoming events and things like that, Tracy says, great talk, Paul. Then it's great if you can join our email. We send out a blast every about 3 months or so, listing all of our upcoming programs and events and things happening here at the homestead. So it's a great way to kind of keep up to date on what types of programs and things that we are offering. And also, if you head over to our website, you can sign up for all the programs that Paul had mentioned coming up in February. And we also have some programs listed for March there as well. So you can get a head start in signing up for our programs. And with that, I think we are going to go ahead and, oh, Joyce says, thank you very much.
Thanks, Joyce.
Another question that we just had is, what are some of the challenges that the museum seems to be facing right now?
Well, a couple come to mind right away, because we're in the middle of this, is school tours coming back and working with schools as students are, struggling to reconnect and try to make up for lost ground and all that. It's great to have school groups come out, and I think it's a good experience for them just to be able to see the museum. But I think that's one thing that we're working with, because we're doing a new program that Jenny actually was largely responsible for. So that definitely comes to mind. And I think just coming out of the pandemic and just seeing what comfort level people have being in person and seeing how those go. But hopefully we start with February and things like the Temple City Talk and others, the Love Letters tours, and then, try to get a good feel for how we can move forward with some of these in-person programs again. And we are working on a schedule for the rest of 2023 as well. So yeah, more to come.
So hopefully that answers your question. And with that, we are going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you all so very much for attending, and hopefully we will see you at the homestead very soon.
All right. Take care, and thank you again.